Bienvenue sur le campus de l'Université d'Ottawa pour cette journée de réflexion et d'échange concernant un sujet qui nous touche tous et toutes. Pour l'Université d'Ottawa, c'est un grand honneur de joindre ses forces à Amnesty International et la Coalition pour la surveillance internationale des libertés civiles, représentée par Neve et Roch Tassé. I want to stress how very proud the University of Ottawa is to host and to participate in this important event today. Our Human Rights Research and Education Center, of which the director, John Packer, is here today, our Center for International Policy Studies, under the leadership of Roland Paris, who will be here later this morning, have joined with Amnesty and the International Monitoring Group to organize a full day of rich and stimulating discussion. The panels and the presentations today will look at the issues from a variety of viewpoints: legal, personal, political, and practical. Your luncheon session will offer an exceptional opportunity to hear from the learned jurists who examined these issues in the context of the compelling cases that demonstrated the appalling human cost that must be paid when we don't get the balance right between our security interests and personal liberty. When I first met with Alex and John Packer last spring to talk about the prospect of this conference, we could not have known how circumstances would evolve to make today's discussion not only timely, but indeed urgently necessary. The convergence of events in recent weeks, including the tabling by the government of legislation and the imminent tabling of additional legislation, together with last week's horrendous crime and the tragic loss of life on Parliament Hill, bring all of these questions once again into very sharp focus. We need today's discussion. We need a full, open, and critical evaluation of the measures being proposed as against the measures already in place. We need to ask questions about where are the gaps? Why are existing measures not sufficient? Where, indeed, do existing measures go too far? How should we apply, in the current circumstances, the bitter lessons of the past? Universities are ideal places in which these questions can be asked, to engage in a critical assessment of policy choices. That discussion must be full, fearless, and frank. And indeed, that is what your program promises today. Alors, je vous souhaite une excellente journée. Je suis confiant qu'on va examiner étroitement les enjeux qui sont devant nous maintenant comme pays et ajouter à la discussion publique concernant le projet de loi qui est maintenant devant le Parlement du Canada. I hope you forgive me if I come and go throughout the day because other obligations make it impossible for me to be here throughout. But I will be back for various parts of the program, and I will watch the entirety with great interest on CPAC, which I'm glad to see is here today. Alors, merci encore et bonne journée.
Merci, Monsieur le Recteur, pour ces mots de bienvenue. Sachez que le comité organisateur est ravi que l'événement se tienne ici à l'Université d'Ottawa et particulièrement dans cette magnifique chapelle. Mon nom est Roch Tassé. Je désire, au nom du comité organisateur, souhaiter la bienvenue à tous et à toutes présentes ici aujourd'hui. Avant de dire quelques mots sur les buts de la conférence aujourd'hui, je voudrais partager un souvenir personnel. Je me rappelle que lorsque j'étais étudiant ici à l'Université en sciences politiques, le 17 octobre 1970, j'étais assis dans la salle ici. Nous avions décidé au département de sciences politiques de boycotter les cours et d'avoir une journée d'études pour se pencher sur l'examen de la loi sur les mesures de guerre et de voir quels étaient les impacts sur nos libertés et sur nos droits. Donc, j'ai un étrange sentiment de déjà-vu aujourd'hui en présentant les objectifs de la conférence. The idea of this conference, Arar plus 10, was born some 18 months ago in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations about the spying activities of the NSA and CSEC. We were struck at the time that in the public debate that followed the revelations, policymakers, politicians, the medias, seeking ways to make these agencies more accountable and more transparent, were never referring to the recommendations of the O'Connor Commission into the case of Maher Arar. ICLMG, Amnesty International, and several others like BCCLA and the National Council of Canadian Muslims had intervener status before the Commission, and we engaged with the Commission over a two-year period. When the reports of the Commission came out, there were two reports. We were very pleased to see that some of the recommendations put forward by the group of interveners were retained by Justice O'Connor. The first recommendation was to create a second inquiry to look into the cases of abuses of other Canadians, such as Abdullah Al-Maki, who's with us today, who were innocent victims of abuses and torture committed abroad as a result of the actions of Canadian officials. The second recommendation that we had proposed to the Commission and was adopted, recommended by Justice O'Connor, was to create a very robust and integrated oversight and overview mechanism to overview the national security operations, not only of the RCMP, but of CSEC, CBSA, and a dozen or so more national agencies involved in national security cases. Furthermore, in December 2009, a majority vote in the House of Commons supported a motion calling on the government to implement those recommendations, including the oversight mechanism. 10 years after, we're still waiting for the implementation. Voici donc ce qui nous a amené à conclure qu'il serait opportun de réunir certains acteurs de la commission O'Connor afin de réfléchir sur la pertinence des recommandations dans le contexte actuel. Nous avons aussi réalisé qu'il serait important de faire le point sur d'autres cas d'abus commis au nom de la sécurité nationale dans le contexte de la guerre contre le terrorisme et d'évaluer l'état des droits de la personne et des libertés civiles 10 ans après une décennie de mesures et de lois antiterroristes, soi-disant antiterroristes. Le résultat, donc, c'est l'agenda que vous avez entre les mains aujourd'hui. The past decade has been one of troubling revelations of serious human rights violations in national security cases, directly or indirectly committed as a result of the actions of Canadian officials, and a growing realization that there has been inadequate review and oversight to safeguard against that occurring. It has been a decade of important findings and recommendations from judicial inquiries and court judgments, including the Supreme Court of Canada, that were focused on Canadian complicity in overseas human rights violations in cases of national security. Over the course of the day, we will review the revelations, findings, and recommendations offered by judges and take stock of the government's record of compliance and implementation. We will explore what lessons have been learned, what changes have been instituted, what reforms are still needed. We will have an opportunity to consider those important questions with some of the individuals who have endured the violations, with key players from the inquiries and court rulings, journalists who cover the issues, and experts who have offered some advice. But the key objective is forward-looking. It is our hope that today's reflection will highlight outstanding areas of concern and identify specific and very concrete advocacy and law reform strategies that will guide our work in coming months and the foreseeable future. Lorsque nous avons amorcé la planification de cet événement, il y a une chose dont nous étions certains. Nous savions que nous pouvions réunir un groupe de panélistes d'un calibre exceptionnel pour partager avec nous leur expérience et réfléchir. Ils nous aident à aller de l'avant avec un plan d'action. On n'a qu'à regarder la liste des intervenants aujourd'hui pour confirmer qu'on avait raison sur ce point. Il y a deux choses, par contre, qu'on ne savait pas à l'époque. La première, c'est que nous aurions le privilège d'avoir les 3 juges présents, les 3 juges qui ont présidé aux 3 commissions d'enquête en matière de sécurité nationale au cours de la dernière décennie. C'est un honneur pour nous d'avoir leur présence avec nous aujourd'hui. Et deuxièmement, évidemment, ce qu'on ne pouvait pas prédire, c'est les tragiques événements de la semaine dernière. Alors, dans la foulée de ces événements, et compte tenu de la réaction du gouvernement, nous sommes convaincus que les objectifs de la conférence sont plus que jamais pertinents. Dans ce contexte, nous espérons que les présentations et les échanges de la journée nous aideront à mieux saisir les défis auxquels nous serons confrontés au cours des prochains mois et élaborer des éléments de stratégie pour y faire face. In closing, I want to acknowledge the support of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, without whose contribution this event would not have been possible. So thank you. I also want to let you know that the event is being filmed by CPAC and by SIPS, and some edited versions of the deliberations today should be online shortly. Finally, you will have noticed that the agenda is really intense, very dense. So I would urge all of us, moderators, panelists, participants who will ask questions from the floor, to be really rigorous and disciplined. So without any further comments, I would like to welcome Alex Neve, Secretary General of Amnesty International, who will give us an overview of the last decade in matters of law and national security.
Thanks very much, and thank you, President Roch, for your words of welcome. So that's a small task I've been given, an overview of the past decade. Obviously, it's going to be a fairly high-level overview, but I hope one that will touch upon some key themes and begin to frame some of the issues that we expect are going to emerge through the course of the day as the various panels unfold. Obviously, this is all about national security, and it's all about human rights. And long has been the debate between the two, in Canada and around the world. Governments have repeatedly asserted that pressing national security considerations are such that they cannot live up to their international human rights obligations, and that the challenges of responding to security threats, such as concerns about terrorism, should somehow serve to justify and excuse human rights violations, to justify detention without charge, or to excuse indefinite imprisonment, to justify restrictions on fair trial rights, such as the right to know and challenge all evidence and witnesses, to excuse decisions to deny or limit public access to court proceedings, to justify law enforcement and security operations that are discriminatory and end up targeting people on the basis of political opinion and religious belief, and that excuse torture or ill treatment. The arguments are made as if the international human rights system gives no consideration to emergencies and serious threats that a government may face. But of course it does. The international human rights system was, after all, not crafted by Amnesty International and the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. It was crafted by governments. And over the years and decades of debating and drafting and agreeing to a long list of human rights treaties, declarations, principles, and resolutions, governments have been, importantly, very much guided by one fundamental principle that they themselves recognized as the very corner to a peaceful, stable, and just world. And perhaps nowhere is that more simply and powerfully stated than the words used 66 years ago in agreeing to the historic UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the opening preamble to which states, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." That lies out the vision. Human rights do not stand in the way. They are, in fact, the very basis and foundation of freedom, justice, and peace, And the combination of those three concepts surely is the very definition of security. Governments did obviously understand the tension that arises. They recognized, therefore, that the very scope and definition of some rights may inherently involve limits for such imperatives as national security. We see that with such rights as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, but not, notably, with fair trial rights. Governments went on to recognize that there may be extraordinary times which might justify further limitations on rights. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example, this power to derogate from human rights obligations is very strictly confined to, quote, a public emergency which threatens the life of the nation. Furthermore, it must be officially proclaimed. It only justifies measures which are strictly required, and it cannot in any way, shape, or form involve discrimination. The bar is set high. And even at that, however, governments knew that there were some rights that can never be violated, no matter the threat, challenge, or emergency. That includes the right to life, the protection against torture, and the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. In giving those rights that status, governments recognized that those rights are at the very heart of what it is to have human rights in the first place, and that to ever allow or justify such fundamental rights being breached for any reason is to give up not only on human rights, but the vision of rights as the cornerstone to peace, justice, and security. Amnesty International has faced the argument that security challenges justify human rights violations for decades, long before the September the 11th terrorist attacks brought the debate to the global fore. Often, far too often, it has been a crude and barely disguised mask to what is in truth blatant and illegal persecution, be it against political opponents, an ethnic minority, or a particular religious faith. In other cases, even when faced with arguably a true security threat, the measures used have gone far beyond what is necessary and what is legal. And if anything, the intensity of the government crackdown, be it the barely disguised persecution or the over-the-top response to an actual security threat, serves only to create more victims, foment violence, deepen divisions, and ultimately, therefore, foster greater insecurity. The aftermath of the September the 11th attacks is by no means the first time that national security laws and practices have eroded or undermined human rights protection in Western democracies. It was a constant concern with respect to the UK government's response to the IRA in Northern Ireland, for instance. Numerous Amnesty International reports attest to that. And we all know the obvious Canadian example that Roch has reminded us of invocation of the War Measures Act in 1970. But there has obviously been something different since September the 11th. Different in that governments around the world, West and East, North and South, were implicated in the same global debate. The measures used, be they legal or extra-legal or illegal, most definitely differed, but the background context was the same. Different as well in that the debate has come out of the shadows. Politicians, public officials, opinion leaders have not at all been reluctant to frame the debate as an either-or proposition. We can have national security, we can have human rights protection, but it's a zero-sum game. More of either means less of the other. And in two very significant ways, Canada found itself drawn in. First, as the post-September the 11th world of counterterrorism took shape, it became clear that there were Canadian legal provisions, some already existing and others added or reformed, that infringed key human rights protections or facilitated the possibility of human rights violations elsewhere, that were now being explained as being necessary to meet security challenges. The Immigration and Refugee Act provisions allowing deportation to face a serious risk of torture in another country. That's an odious provision, long-standing, that blatantly and unashamedly violates our obligations under the UN Convention Against Torture. And going back well over 15 years now, numerous UN human rights bodies and experts have urged, pleaded, cajoled Canada to repeal it, but it stands. The Immigration Security Certificate provisions in that same act, making it nearly impossible for an individual who is subject to a certificate to mount a meaningful defense due to significant evidence and witnesses being withheld. Again, various UN bodies have pushed for those provisions to be reformed so as to meet international fair trial standards, and those international bodies have continued to make that call even after the 2008 changes that introduced the special advocate system into the security certificate proceedings. There's the provisions in the Extradition Act and whether they sufficiently protect against the risk of torture-tainted intelligence being used in extradition proceedings, as has been debated in the Hassan Diab case. And there are, of course, the sections of the Canada Evidence Act authorizing restrictions on access to important evidence in trials and other legal proceedings for a wide range of reasons, including security, national defense, and the broad notion of international relations. I can well imagine we're going to hear throughout the day about this area of concern, particularly from the various lawyers who will be taking part, and the ways that those proceedings very often virtually gut the principle of fair legal proceedings. So that's the law. But second, it was not by any means limited to concerns about Canadian laws that failed to meet international human rights requirements. It became very clear that there was a great deal happening outside of these legal frameworks, be it intelligence practices, law enforcement activities, or military operations, and that those involved Canadian officials in a range of different contexts in situations where their actions and inaction were directly or indirectly causing or contributing to human rights violations in other countries, in some cases violations against Canadian citizens, in other instances foreign nationals, and where the backdrop was national security. Well, here the cases began to mount quickly, the areas of concern grew rapidly, and many of these we're going to hear referenced throughout the course of the day. There are the extraordinary rendition cases. Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed Abu el-Mati, Muyad Nuruddin, Abu Sufyan Abdul Razik, Meher Arar, Canadian citizens who experienced grave human rights violations in other countries, in Syria, in Egypt, in Sudan, violations that were directly or indirectly condoned, facilitated, or caused by Canadian security, law enforcement, and diplomatic officials. The cases came to be known as the Canadian rendition cases in the sense that they followed the pattern of sending individuals off to other countries where the dirty work would be done by others. Not the US variety with expensive spy planes in the middle of the night, but by sharing the right intelligence with the right country at the right time, and a very similar result: arbitrary arrest, illegal imprisonment, unlawful interrogations, and torture. In those cases, and in others, there has also been the failure or even refusal to intervene, to take action, to defend the rights of Canadian citizens when they clearly and desperately need that assistance. That is, of course, so much the troubling story at the heart of Omar Khadr's 12-year saga of injustice. Rather than stand up to US officials and condemn the agonizing sleep deprivation he endured at Guantanamo Bay, intelligence officers show up to take advantage of a youth who has been tortured. Rather than insist of his US jailers that his rights as a juvenile offender and, of course, as a child soldier be respected, stay completely silent on the point and even continue that charade of injustice by arguing before Canadian courts that he still should not be accorded those rights even now that he is in a Canadian prison. Even today, that failure to intervene, even against an entirely spurious backdrop of national security charges, haunts Canadian citizens and permanent residents. I think it's worth, as we gather here today, remembering the plight of Mohammed Fahmy and Khaled al-Qazaz, both imprisoned unlawfully in Egypt right now on wholly unfounded and unsubstantiated terrorism and security grounds, but where Canada's appetite and willingness to take action has been at best tepid. Then there was the notorious practice of battlefield detainee transfers in Afghanistan, for many years handed over by Canadian soldiers to US forces, despite concerns about torture and conditions in US detention centers in Afghanistan and the risk of being sent on to the lawlessness of Guantanamo. And then that changed to a transfer to Afghan forces, a practice that went on for a further 5.5 years. There was clear evidence that transferred detainees faced a serious risk of torture. The Canadian government denied and downplayed that risk, argued that it had been addressed through Afghan promises and Canadian monitoring. But at the end of the day, the legal argument that was advanced by government and prevailed in the courts was that it really didn't matter in the end anyway, because the Charter of Rights simply didn't apply once Canadian troops had left the country. As Roch Tassé noted in his remarks, the initial impetus for today's conference was a simple one. It has been a decade since the very important decision of the government back in 2004 to establish a judicial inquiry to look into the Arar case. Reflecting on that anniversary, certainly not a happy one, but a significant one, offers a valuable opportunity to review a decade of judging for human rights in an era of national security, and also to take account of how government has responded to what the judges have ruled and recommended. And what emerges is notable. First, there have been numerous and very eloquent reminders from judges about the very framework I laid out at the beginning of my remarks, that when it comes to security, it begins and ends with scrupulous regard for human rights. It's the high-profile cases, the Supreme Court, the judicial inquiries that are usually quoted when we turn to that. They usually get the spotlight, but it's important to recognize we hear that affirmation from judges at all levels. For instance, Mr. Justice Speyer of the Ontario Superior Court in United States of America versus Abdullah Khader, an extradition case. There will always be a tension, especially in troubled times, in the balancing of intelligence and security issues with cherished democratic values, such as the rule of law and protection from human rights violations. In civilized democracies, it is the rule of law that must prevail over intelligence objectives. Second, rulings that have involved challenges to the proper interpretation and application of specific provisions in Canadian law, well, they've gone both ways. From a human rights perspective, in these cases, judges have sometimes been champions and have sometimes disappointed. In 2002, admittedly a bit before our 10-year anniversary period, the Supreme Court upheld, albeit with much restraint, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act provisions allowing deportations to torture. In 2007, they struck down that act's immigration security certificate proceedings as denying fair trial protections, but then upheld the revised and, in our view, still flawed security certificate system earlier this year. But third, when judges have turned their attention to practices happening outside clear legal frameworks, be it through judicial inquiries or court rulings, the result has been very different. Here, they have consistently reined government in. Human rights have prevailed, and government action has been routinely found to violate international law and the Charter of Rights. That was so in the Arar inquiry. That was so in Justice Yacobucci's inquiry into the cases of Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed Abu al-Mati, and Muyad Nuruddin. That was so not once, but twice in the Supreme Court's Omar Khader judgments. That was so in the federal court's 2009 ruling in Abdul Razik, ruling against the government for withholding a passport from a Canadian citizen stranded in Sudan who had been tortured there in circumstances where CSIS was implicated, and many more examples. Canada's 3 judicial inquiries dealing with national security are going to be in the spotlight at midday, with the panel made up of retired Justices Frank Iacobucci, John Major, and Dennis O'Connor. 2 of those inquiries very directly dealt with the relationship between human rights and national security. And Justices Iacobucci and O'Connor could not have been more clear or more forceful. Here's Justice Iacobucci. The respect for rights and freedoms is a constraint on a democracy that terrorists do not share. Indeed, by their very actions, they repudiate these rights and freedoms. For the terrorist, the end justifies the means. A democracy, however, must justify the means to any end, including, in this case, its response to terrorism. Canada must choose means to deal with terrorism that are governed by the rule of law and respect for our cherished values of freedom and due process. This is a balance that is easy to describe but difficult to attain. However, difficulty of achievement cannot be an excuse for not trying to achieve that equilibrium. From Justice O'Connor. In a recent address, the Secretary General of the United Nations said, "Let us be clear, torture can never be an instrument to fight terror, for torture is an instrument of terror." That statement succinctly captures the special nature of the right to be free from torture. It is absolute. Some human rights, such as the right to privacy, may be lawfully suspended under certain conditions in the name of public emergency. This is made explicit in international human rights treaties and is implicit in Canada's constitutional standards. But the right to be free from torture is different in a very important way. The infliction of torture for any purpose is so fundamental a violation of human dignity that it can never be legally justified. Well, that brings me to a final general observation. Over this past decade, it is in these cases, the extra-legal world of government national security activities outside of legal frameworks, where government has pushed back and either ignored or openly defied the judges. Things started positively with the aftermath of the Arar inquiry. Mayor Arar did receive an apology and compensation for the human rights violations that had been caused or condoned by Canadian officials. But the entire second half of that inquiry, Commissioner O'Connor's impressive and sorely needed proposed model for comprehensive and integrated review and oversight of Canadian security, law enforcement, and government agencies and departments involved in national security activities, has gathered dust for 8 years now. Justice O'Connor made a very specific recommendation about intelligence sharing with foreign governments, urging that, quote, information should never be provided to a foreign country where there is a credible risk that it will cause or contribute to the use of torture. Well, that has been very directly flouted with the recent ministerial directions from the Public Safety Minister and the Minister of National Defence to CSIS, to the RCMP, to CSEC, to CBSA, to the military, authorizing just that, sharing intelligence even if it may likely cause torture. It is limited to exceptional circumstances, but remember, there's no tolerance for exceptional circumstances when it comes to international laws banning torture. Things get particularly dismal when we turn to the response to Commissioner Iacobucci's inquiry, at the end of which he had catalogued a long list of ways that through both action and inaction, Canadian officials had contributed to the serious human rights violations of Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed Abu al-Mati, and Muyad Nuruddin in Syria, and in Mr. al-Mati's case, also in Egypt. Those violations included extensive torture. This time around, there's been no redress, not even an apology. Instead, those 3 men have been mired in contentious and protracted litigation for years now. And similarly, the Omar Khadr case. there have been 2 Supreme Court of Canada rulings, 2, both finding that government conduct had violated his charter rights, in particular by being a willing beneficiary of the grueling sleep deprivation he was subjected to by his US captors at Guantanamo Bay. The court didn't specify how to remedy that charter violation, as it involved the world of foreign relations. And the government has not. Almost 5 years now since the second of those Supreme Court of Canada rulings, there's no remedy that's been provided. Quite the contrary, the government continues to thwart Omar Khadr's efforts to end the violations he has endured. When we planned today's conference, we never imagined that we would be gathering in the aftermath of last week's very tragic and troubling attacks in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and Ottawa, and that we would be facing renewed national security law reform, including the prospect of legal changes that may well contravene or undermine important human rights norms. We've not changed direction today. We're not intending to spend our day debating Bill C-44 or speculating about what further bills are still to come. Our focus is on learning from the lessons of this past decade, a decade in which judges have repeatedly insisted that the government must put human rights at the heart of national security and cannot use security challenges and threats as an excuse for failing to do so. It has also been a decade in which we have frequently heard strong rhetoric from government when talking about national security. Rhetoric, though, that too often does not translate into concrete action and practical commitment. Ask Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Mati, Muyad Nuruddin, Omar Khadr, Abu Sufyan Abdul Razik, or the men who have been put through and are still going through the immigration security certificate process. Ask their families just what that failure to uphold human rights looks like and how it feels. Whatever new national security laws are introduced in the days and weeks to come, there will be debate, and their human rights impact will no doubt be challenged in the courts. But today's conference, I'm confident, is going to remind us that we also need to look back if we are seriously going to move away from this notion of human rights versus national security and embrace instead the fundamental principle of human rights and national security. I want to end with 3 high-level calls which I know we will hear more about during the course of the day. And I just realized I had this on PowerPoint, and I forgot to set it up, so give me 1 minute here. First, comply with obligations. It seems such a simple thing to say, but it is so central. Even in fact, I would say particularly in the national security arena, Canadian law must conform, explicitly conform to, not flout, our international human rights obligations. How about outright banning deportation to torture in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, for a start? It's important for what happens here domestically. It is also equally important for the message it sends to the rest of the world. And that's such a critical piece as well here. We're not just talking about what this does and does not mean in Canada. The action, the inaction, the good law reform, the bad law reform, the proud compliance with international obligations, the failure to comply with international obligations, all sends an important global message. Second, remedy past violations. Omar Khadr shouldn't have to keep fighting in court for his many human rights violations to be ended and rectified. Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed Abu al-Mati, and Muyad Nuruddin shouldn't be lost in years of court battles to get the government to act on a report from a respected former Supreme Court of Canada justice. These violations must be addressed. And third, get serious about review and oversight. 8 years ago, Commissioner O'Connor put in front of Canada the roadmap for putting in place a model of review and oversight of all the various agencies and departments that are involved in national security in Canada. There have been no steps in that direction. And with every new national security-related human rights concern that arises, take the recent revelations of mass electronic surveillance, the consequences of our very significant review and oversight deficit become more evident, and the need for it to be addressed more urgent. We simply cannot afford to embark on another round of reforms to national security laws without, at long last, putting meaningful review and oversight in place. There's a lot more that could be said about this past decade, but I welcome that opportunity to share with you some high-level thoughts about where we've been, the challenges we've faced, the challenges that remain, and the lessons that offer us as we move once again into what may be a difficult national debate about our national security laws and the need to ensure that human rights don't lose out. Thanks very much, and I look forward to all the conversations we're going to have today.